Yeah, so though there might not have been any great kind of uh, difference for the Greeks in terms of uh, either using philosophy or science uh, interchangeably as terms. Um, for us today, that is not the case. Today, we believe that that which is philosophical is necessarily unscientific or non scientific, if you like. Either of the two words is fine. And we basically believe that there is a thing called a science uh, which has the capability of demystifying everything and anything. It can demystify the nature, it can demystify the universe, it can demystify personal lives, it can demystify society, uh, and it can also demystify uh, intersocial relationships, meaning not uh, relationships that are constituted in members of a society, but uh, those which are not interactions between members of one society, but two different societies altogether. How do they interact with each other? One of the best examples that I can give you is John Stuart Mill. Now, John Stuart Mill is somebody I, for many reasons, admire a lot. And his contribution to liberalism in particular and political science in general uh, is perhaps very, very underestimated. However, if you look at uh, Mill, Mill makes a cardinal error, a very, very cardinal error, while talking about China and India. He believes that both these civilizations in the past were great civilizations, but due to lack of innovation in productivity and what he calls laziness among the citizens to do anything, this led to a situation wherein you have both India and China losing all their development and becoming barbaric societies. Barbaric is not something that I'm using, that is a word that John Stuart Mill himself used. And it's a very strong word to say that, Indians and Chinese were barbaric is really, really an inaccurate description of the then present of both China and India. Okay, both these countries, in different ways, had been plundered by colonial powers. Uh, India had predominantly one colonial power, which was Britain, though we did have pockets of uh, French colonialism in Chandrapur and in Yanam. Yanam is a part of Pondicherry, but it is something that is abutting. It's a small island abutting the state of, not the state of, the city of Kakinada in Andhra Pradesh. And Chandrapur is in West Bengal. They had their own presence in Pondicherry, uh, which is where the mystique of Aurobindo and his spiritual successor was called the Mother. Uh, they lived there, and since Pondicherry, which is actually Puducherry, was more of a home to the local populace, you have the creation of a separate enclave for people who believed in this mother and this lady was a French lady. That is the significance of it all. And so if anybody who was French wanted to stay in the place where the mother was staying, or if there was any Frenchman who wanted to spend the rest of his or her life uh, in the sanctuary of the mother, then you would see that these were people who settled down in a place which is called, or which is called, Oroville. Okay, it is not Puducherry or Pondicherry. It is a place which is slightly far removed from Puducherry. So you have this one particular pocket, uh, but not many people mention it under colonialism because while it was a place which was definitely under the control of the French, as was Yanam, uh, which is abutting Andhra Pradesh, you will find that there has been uh, a patronage given to this lady who was called the Mother. And so it was just a settlement of the French people. It didn't have all the features of the colonialism that the British had actually uh, shown us, which is looting, plundering, all those things. Now, there was another pocket, which is Goa, Daman, Diu, all islands again. And these were under the control of the Portuguese till 1960. And it was only then that they were brought into the mainstream of India and they were declared a part of uh, the Indian the Indian nation and nation state called India. So Portuguese pockets were also there, and they were latecomers into the Indian Union, so to speak. And then in areas of Chhattisgarh and going into Jharkhand and also into some peripheral areas of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. You had a purely missionary kind of activity that was being done by the Flemish people. Now, the Flemish people are people from the Nordic Scandinavian regions, which means they are from Denmark, they are from a few of them from Netherlands, a few of them from Sweden, and so there was a little bit of everyone here. And they were not into trade, they were not into looting, they were not into plundering, they were only into the original agenda of proliferating Christianity among the tribals. So you still find more than a token presence of Flemish missionaries in the areas that I have mentioned. So we did have these people, but they weren't contributing in any way to colonialism. France, up till the Battle of Plassey, actually was uh, doing exactly what the British were doing. It was being a colonial power. But the Battle of Plassey has to be taken as a decisive moment in Indian history, because once the French were out, they lost the Battle of Plassey, then they were confined to these pockets that I talked to you about. And hence they ceased to be of any significance in terms of colonialism. But if you were to look at China, China presents a very, very different picture. China was not colonized by one power. China was colonized equally by several powers. Okay, one power that colonized China was definitely the British or the Great Britain. And we know about the opium wars and how the British sold opium to the Chinese to keep them from rebelling against them. And I'm extremely sorry about these canines are stuck to me, and then they do this. Yeah, and so as I was telling you, the scenario in China was completely different. There was Great Britain, and it was supplying the local people with opium so that they don't rebel or revolt against the British. And uh, on the eastern tip of China, you had another country colonizing it. That particular country was Japan. Now, when we talk about colonialism, we rarely talk about Japan, and there is a reason for that. Japanese colonialism is certainly not benevolent, but it isn't the kind of colonialism which the Europeans indulged in, which is, what do we say, uh, loot, plunder, take away the raw material, manufacture those goods and bring them back to the colony and try to sell them here. So that was the British model. But if you look at, then that's not just the British model. It is also the European model in general. If you look at the Spaniards, they didn't come towards India, but they went to Central America, then they went to South America, and it is there that they established their hegemony. And there's actually a very interesting story how the Spanish were outsmarted in the colonial states by the British. And for that, I would ask you to read uh, this particular book. I must have already suggested to you. It is called The Ascent of Money, ASCENT, Ascent of Money. And it's written by Niall Ferguson, Niall, Niall Ferguson. And so if you see that, you basically get the idea about what the problem is with uh, the Spanish form of colonialism and why the British were able to soundly beat them. Okay, so that is one story. And so you have the British uh, looting the areas they were going to in China. And on the East Coast, you had the you basically had the Japanese building up their variety of colonialism, which was not just loot, it was also something that led to the development of the particular area where the Japanese had actually set up their colonies. So if you look at development in China today, uh, it is extremely difficult to talk about development in China because nothing about the Chinese is transparent. Everything about them is opaque. And if everything about them is opaque, then we don't really know what is happening. But what we can see roughly where we are is that most of the developed areas of China today are, the eastern regions, provinces like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and since the capital is Beijing, Beijing is another area. So you'll see that there is a lot of development in the areas that have been colonized by the Japanese. Uh, but the areas that have been colonized by the British have been plundered. And to add to the misery of the Chinese, you have this particular uh, tendency, which is actually the tendency of the Russians to colonize areas of China. Now, if you look at the Russian model of federalism or colonialism, sorry, uh, it is significantly different from all other models of colonialism. And if you take Britain went to all different parts of the world. Similarly, the Spanish went to all different parts of the world, and so did the French. Africa was one hot spot where everybody was fighting for control, as was South America. But South America was more of a bone of contention between the Portuguese and and the Spaniards had greater control than the Portuguese. The Portuguese, I think, were ultimately left with Brazil alone and not much else. And so, if you see the Central American region down to the tip of the Southern American continent, what you do find is that it is Spanish colonialism. Okay. And now, if you look at the colonialism of the Russians didn't bother to go to different parts of the world in order to colonize them. They did not go to different parts of the world simply because they could not. It's as simple as that. Now, if you look at in England or Great Britain, it benefited a lot from the Industrial Revolution. You can say the same thing of Spain as well, though Spain was more into plundering silver from the other nations to increase the worth of its own self. And uh, if you therefore look at these people, they had leveraged those things that happened historically in their favor to further consolidate their power over the world. So colonialism, in that sense, became a global phenomenon, but not Russian colonialism. Russian colonialism was all the countries that surrounded Russia. So Russia, when it broke up, USSR, when it broke up in 1989, 1990, you see that it broke up very, very peacefully, and it went back to being 16 republics rather than one USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So, what do you see? On the Central Asian side, you see the Russians had colonized these very backward areas, such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, all these Islamic nations which fell uh, in the Central Asian region, and those that were contiguous with uh, the territories of Russia. So they constituted one part of the Soviet colonialism. The other part of the Soviet colonialism was the European part. So you will see that Belarus, which was then called Byelorusia, then you had Ukraine, which is still called Ukraine, and for some strange reason wants to be a part of the NATO powers. And if you look further, you'll see that Russian colonialism went almost into Finland. So Russia only colonized those countries rather, I'm sorry, which were surrounding it in a manner of speaking. So why? The answer is simple. Russia did not develop into a capitalist nation. So its colonialism was also not colonialism, but it was, truly speaking, an imperialism, Tsarist imperialism. The Tsars believed that Russia was superior, all kinds of things. And so they went around conquering uh, territories which were around them. So you see, so parts of China were also taken by the Russians. Parts of China which bordered with Russia, Sakhalin Islands, and a couple of other provinces whose names I cannot recollect now. So, if you don't mind, uh, just look at a map and then you'll get those names. And what you will find is China was therefore one kind of colonialism, which was plunder and loot. The other was develop Japan, develop the areas wherein the colonial power was operating, and then you can also look at an imperialist power, which was feudal in nature. It hadn't become capitalist yet. So there were three different types of powers that were actually colonizing China, which makes the picture even more difficult to understand. But what we do know, if you look into the history of both India and China, India was once the richest and most developed economies of the world. China was a close second, perhaps. And what happened is, with the coming in of colonialism, there was a tendency for underdevelopment, and that tendency overtook these two countries. Now, let's try and understand what underdevelopment means and how it is different from a lack of development, or if you want to put it rather inelegantly, um, you would say lack of, undevelopment or lack of development. So that is very different. If something that is the kind of thing that you saw in Africa. In Africa, even today, people don't understand the concept of a nation state. Okay, and that is why all kinds of corruption can be induced into Africa. But in the countries like India and China, there wasn't a lack of development. We were, in fact, more developed than Europe. So, if these countries were more developed than Europe, it was basically the industrial revolution and its ability to produce goods with a certain kind of consistent quality at lower prices, which killed the artisan industry, both in India and in China. So that is underdevelopment. Underdevelopment is losing all the development that you had. You don't start at zero. Suppose this is a line, this joint here in my fingers. This is, let's say, zero. Underdevelopment doesn't begin at zero. This side is positive. So if it was plus 30 before colonialism, After colonialism, it became minus 70. So not only did they lose whatever development they had, they also went back. They continued to go back and not develop at all. So if you look at these scenarios, you will see that these scenarios will tell you that there was nothing barbaric about Indians or the Chinese. It's just that they were victims of a certain kind of colonialism. Or in the case of China, certain kinds of colonialism. Okay, but John Stuart Mill, for all his wisdom, is quite happy to call both these countries uh, barbaric and lacking in development and lacking in civilization, which is uh, which is an accusation which is very difficult to maintain. Okay, in fact, a lot of all the good work that was done by John Stuart Mill got negated by statements like this, which reeked of stupidity and did not inform the people who were listening to him, reading him, as to what actually happened to the Indians and the uh, Chinese. So he says, as if it was some kind of a story in which you had these people who were once developed but uh, became the planet of the apes. So something like that. So it isn't that kind of a story at all. But yet the story that John Stuart Mill tells you is this. Now, it took a very long time before historians of various hues. I'm not going to talk about China simply because of the fact that I'm not aware of which, except for a few historians like Yu Shaoqi and another couple of them. I really cannot uh, speak with any authenticity upon what really happened in China. But I can speak with some degree of authority about what happened in India. Okay? And India, which was prosperous, was reduced to poverty. And poverty was equated to barbarism by uh, John Stuart Mill. But this is an unfair characterization, a very, very unfair characterization. So here, you will say that if you have to get a fair characterization, then the characterization should be in facts and not in values. I was talking to you about this the last time, which was the fact value dichotomy. Okay? That facts and values are different from each other. This is the segue that I was talking about. On one side, you had people saying that there's no need, essentially, to make a distinction between science and non science. But on the other hand, you had the positivists, the empiricists, about whom we will be talking about in detail later. So you will find these people are basically positives basically they, they basically ensure they ensured that uh, the dichotomy between facts and uh, facts and I'm sorry, I get distracted by these dogs. Uh, yeah, so by the facts, the dichotomy between facts and values, they continue to maintain that, and they said any knowledge that is true knowledge had to be something which had to have facts in them. And facts were those which can only be, uh, facts were only those which could only be uh, taken into uh, consideration for the purposes of understanding not just the universe, but also human society. Okay, and there is, I told you about a segue. As this positivism and empiricism didn't produce the results that they thought they would produce, you have a return to uh, people talking about philosophy, history, and all these other things, which basically they felt were the ways in which you can learn about a civilization, a country, and then you can basically start describing them. So I hope you'll excuse me. Tomorrow, I'll first talk about the positivist empiricist uh, construct of what a science is and how it can demystify human society. And later on, I'll go into the Peter Winch kind of argument I had in one of the discussions, mentioned Peter Winch and the idea of relative rationality, but I didn't dwell on it. We didn't complete it. So now is the time to complete it. First, but we'll do the positivists and the empiricists. And then we'll go towards the other things, which were essentially a reaction to the failure of positivism and empiricism in producing what they want. But there are people like the Americans who believe that even the so called failed methodology somehow is still the only science that exists. Very few of them still believe in this, but they do believe it in fairly large numbers in the USA. And the USA uh, is not something which is barren in terms of intellectual developments, which went contrary to uh, positivism and empiricism. In fact, the US is a land where you have the birth of pragmatism, of pragmatist philosophy. And uh, two of its best practitioners, John Dewey, uh, but more than John Dewey, Richard Rorty, uh, these people were uh, somehow able to show a way out, but a great section of the American social science academia didn't wish to follow them. Okay, so we'll discuss these when we meet again tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, Sonia apologized, but she had she has some issues with her internet. No,
That's absolutely right. There's no need for apologizing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's absolutely all right.
Okay, Professor.
Okay, so see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Professor.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.